This is Hunt Nebraska, the official podcast for insight into Nebraska's hunting and shooting sports community. Be sure to give us a follow on Facebook, our space for sharing stories, information, tips, and techniques. Now, Hunt Nebraska.
And a big welcome back to the Hunt Nebraska cabin, folks. It is officially, well, I guess we're a few days now into spring, so hopefully it'll start feeling like it here in the great state of Nebraska. Thank you for taking us along for the ride or into the house, into the office, wherever you might be listening to us. Turkey season isn't too far away, so we're going to jump into that real quick, but some faces that you might recognize if you're watching us on YouTube, and we do appreciate that. We've got Michael Addison from the National Wild Turkey Federation. You got me, Hershy from Nebraska Game and Parks, and back, despite warnings from his peers and his professional folks that he gets to rub elbows with, back, Dr. Andy Little from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln.
Appreciate it.
Our Mr. Nebraska Turkey. So how you been doing, Andy?
Doing great. Doing really great.
Did you see the award we won?
I saw that.
Yeah, isn't that impressive?
Yeah,
that is,
absolutely.
folks, hold that up, Michael, right there. It's got a turkey on it and everything, and as long as you don't have high def on your YouTube, you can see that is an award we received recently for outstanding achievement in the field of excellence in the world of podcasting.
That's cool.
Actually, if you notice, it was actually given to us by the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission.
Yes.
Pretty impressive, huh?
Yeah.
Second place, so we've got
That's
a little
awesome.
room to improve yet.
Yep.
So in a self-award, we don't mind that at all, but it's got turkey on it. We'll get that hung up appropriately here in the
We'll catch up
cabin.
to Greg Wagner someday.
There you go. So we're going to talk turkey, which is going to be what a lot of folks and listeners out there are interested in. And you're getting to know more about Nebraska's turkey than probably any other person in history.
Yeah, well, that and our students that are out there in the field that are doing it really every day. And, we're learning a lot. So,
which is kind of cool. We're going to get into turkey research, folks.
Sure.
And maybe you take a step back. You've been on our show before to talk a little bit about what's going on. Let's kind of rehash that. What type of research are we doing to learn what?
Sure, yeah. So here within the state of Nebraska, and this is really kind of a project that's, built out of, really we're seeing this nationally, a lot of declines in wild turkeys. There are some places across the country that are seeing increases in populations, but largely most states are seeing declines in their populations. So last year, January, we started this project, and basically it's a 4.5-year project to look at basically all aspects, or as many aspects as we can, of wild turkey ecology in western Nebraska to see what's going on. Why are we seeing declines in some of these populations? In turn, then, how do we address them? And that's really for the agency to work with landowners and find ways that they can improve management of those lands for the birds. So.
And I want to also kind of toss in here, Michael, that it seems to me that we are learning a whole bunch more about turkeys than we thought we might in a lot of respects.
There's also a lot more interest in it than there was even
That's
10
true.
years ago.
That's true.
From agencies, the public, hunters, there's people seeing a lot more value in research than they might have once thought. Obviously that's spurned on by I'm not seeing as many turkeys in the field.
Sure.
But but it's good to know at least people want they want to know what the problem is, and there's a lot of landowners out there who are also eager to get involved.
Absolutely.
And what can I do to help?
Yeah.
Excellent point, because when our populations were super high.
Yeah.
I mean, we had some of the most densely populated turkey populations in the nation,
Sure.
which I guess you could say, since it's mostly a North American bird, probably on the planet.
Sure.
The way we manage them, all right, it seems to be working.
Sure.
Seems to be
Yeah.
doing well. Yeah. And then as that population comes down for maybe a multitude of reasons or what we're finding, what's hidden behind curtain number 3, it's one of those things that now we do start questioning, well, why is it changing? How's it changing?
Absolutely.
What we did was working, right? And our assumptions that we were making about how we were managing and why we were managing, they worked during those golden years, right? And now it's probably able to zone in a little bit. And that's one thing that really has opened my eyes, is not just the research here in Nebraska, but across the nation where this is taking place. We're kind of learning that some of our past assumptions aren't necessarily accurate.
Yeah. Well, and we're, just learning simple things. And this, I know Mike Chamberlain, who was my former advisor for my PhD at the University of Georgia, and he's a wild turkey doc on various social media handles. And one of the things that he talks about is, he did turkey work back in the early 90s, part of his PhD research, and finding things like, oh, well, we didn't realize these birds are nesting in past June. There was just assumption that they kind of quit nesting, kind of in the early part of June. But, we're finding, and he's been finding as well, these birds will have nests in upwards into early August.
Wow.
And that's not uncommon. So, and again, that's usually it's a hen that has maybe lost their first or second nest, and they may want to go out and set up a third nest potentially. So it just kind of depends. But again, those little simple things like that are just things we kind of maybe took for granted for a while. We just didn't think that, and we start seeing more data come out. We're like, oh wow, this is kind of the case.
And what I want to say, the temptation, and we kind of bid on it sometimes, is, well, don't they have a similar or identical, breeding strategy as ringneck pheasants, where there's a bunch of males, they're polygamous, so hey, one gobbler, many hens, we're golden, and we're finding out perhaps there's a little bit more structure to it than that, even on the hen side. But let's take a step back. What started last January? We're talking January 2023.
Yes,
correct?
That's correct. Yep. Yeah. So the project really, like I said, it kind of necessitated out of this, basically looking at data and seeing that declines are occurring in portions of Nebraska, and what are driving some of that. And so really it was kind of an all-encompassing, or as many, again, things we could look at for this one project over 4.5 years. And we started addressing questions, or a part of this project is looking at nesting success. So how many nests are surviving? Where are those nests occurring?
Good stuff.
So really some basic things, because we don't really have a lot of that data here in Nebraska yet. And we're getting that. We're getting more of that data over time. And it's been a little while since there's been any past research out here on turkey. So this is a project that can provide that more up-to-date data. Obviously, the other thing is, and you think about this in the context of an ag-dominated state, the landscape's changed a lot. You look at landscape, I've pulled data before from USDA NASS, and that's publicly available data to look at things like crop diversity, for example, in Nebraska. And we had our highest crop diversity back in the mid-'60s.
Sure.
Well, now we've seen that decline over time, and that's not total surprise to most people. It's basically we're in a monocultural system now. Corn, beans primarily, especially in this eastern part of the state. And so, all those things kind of play and interact together to, why those, and so getting that more recent information, that data can help us, help the agency really and the landowners implement management strategies to benefit those birds. So kind of backing up, I guess. So again, nesting ecology, looking at, nest success, brood survival, brood success. Looking at just movements of the birds in the landscape, and I can talk a little more about putting GPS transmitters at them here in a second. But then also looking at other aspects of gobbling chronology, and we can probably dive into that a little later on, and putting out these acoustic monitors where we actually are able to take and record the gobbling activity. So I think all of our monitors for this year too, they've already been up for about almost 3 weeks. So they're running, and they'll run into this summer collecting that data. And so we can dive into that probably a little later on. But again, all these little pieces are kind of adding up. I always kind of like to say it's like a puzzle you're trying to put together. So each of these things are like little incremental pieces or puzzle pieces that are to see that picture of what's going on.
The challenge though is you don't have a picture to look at. It's like, all right,
well, that's true. You're right.
We're going to end up over box here.
We don't know what the front of the box
you don't
looks
have
like
front of the box
quite yet.
You pick up that puzzle piece. I don't even know if this is a corner or a middle.
That's true. You don't.
Or something along those lines. So it's so last January you guys trapped.
That's
turkeys.
right.
You got out there late winter. Caught some birds, mostly gobblers, mostly hens. Then
it was a mix. It was a mix of hens and gobblers. So really, what we're trying to target each year is about 120 birds, and that's across 2 different study areas. So we have our study areas, one's up in the Chadron, northwest part of the state, and then the other one's down in McCook, Trenton area in the southwest part of the state. So we kind of divide that up. So we'll say about 60 birds per area.
And this is what I think has opened up a lot of doors, folks, is when you put those GPS collars on them, or GPS, are these backpacks
They're
for
backpacks,
these turkeys?
Yeah, like I always tell, it's just like putting a backpack on to go to school. It's kind of that idea. So,
I mean, the technology
they're
there
pretty neat.
has changed drastically.
Sure, absolutely.
Because years ago, it was the tractors that we had, radio collars or whatever, way too big for turkeys for the most part.
Yeah, and I remember even during my PhD, I didn't have the luxury of GPS like the students now have. And so you're out there with the traditional, the very high frequency transmitters listening for the beeps, and then you'd fall asleep at night and you'd hear the beeps in your sleep. And
I bet so. And for a deaf guy like me, it's like you hear the beep and then it's like, well, I hear the beep over here. Which way's stronger? Okay, it's this way. All right. And then you kind of zero in on it as best you can. But for us deaf guys, it's just like, I don't hear the beep.
That's why they have PhD students doing it, Hershey.
Yeah. We lost our entire sample here. No, I can hear it. Exactly. That's why you have grad students.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, the GPS data, that's really revolutionized really a lot of things in wildlife management and just kind of, wildlife tracking as a whole. So,
because now you don't have to be in the truck necessarily. You can actually... Can you get it on the computer?
So once we capture these birds and we put that transmitter on them, those transmitters, most of them are programmed. Well, we basically change the frequencies of fixes throughout the season. So like last year during the nesting season in particular, we're getting locations every 15 minutes where those birds are at. So very high frequency data sets.
Wow.
And so you can literally, so the students are going out, they have what they call, it's a base station. It's basically a little box and it's attached to an antenna, like kind of traditional setup per se. But basically what they're doing is they're downloading data through what they call UHF, which is basically ultra high frequency. So traditionally you'd have this very high frequency, which is basically the series of beeps, and you're just kind of listening for the loudest beep, and that's the direction where the bird's at. Now you can use that. We basically use this UHF to then identify, okay, we know where the bird's at, but now we need to actually download data from that transmitter it's storing data from that bird. So every location is getting stored on that backpack, and then we can transmit it. And then the units we have this year, we have that UHF, but then we also have GSM, so cellular, so we can actually have that data transmitted up through cellular service, and then we can get that data. So then you can get on your computer and then be able to see some of that information.
So even last year's, you weren't just, the old radio telemetry, you were just zoning in on that location at that point. Now you're saying that you're going there and you can get a whole bunch of data points.
Yeah, so and we can, in similar to last year, you would just get to locations where they would find like a high point, and then they could take and point in that direction where that loudest beep was at, and then they had basically kind of like a VHF on that unit as well as the UHF, and then the UHF is how they transmit the data.
Don't
get me to describe all of that in detail. It gets a little complicated, but the point is then we can get that data remotely from the bird. Because obviously you have no other way once that bird's out in the landscape, you're not going to be able to recapture it in most cases.
So what tells you when the hens go to nest, for example? All of a sudden those dots are all right in one little spot, or
so essentially that's what happens. And so that's what the students will be looking for, is looking at that data as it's coming in every day or every couple of days. They're downloading that information, and then as those birds, obviously during the laying phase, those birds are going to be moving to a spot and picking out where they're going to have a nest at, and then they'll be laying an egg into that nest. And then eventually, after several days, they'll end up going in there and they'll sit down, and then you'll see that big cluster of points that'll start dropping on each other. And that's why, the frequency of having every 15 minutes really gives us a high level of precision of where this bird is at. And then those points pile up, and then we can keep tabs on where that bird is until either the nest is predated or it hatches out or something like that. So, yeah.
And folks, I'm going to do a little shameless plug for Andy here for a minute. If you go on Facebook and look up AWESM Lab.
Yes, absolutely. I should have my hat
let me know if I don't get this right. Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement.
That is right. Yes.
Wow. See, I've been paying attention. You can actually see there's a post on there. It's a couple months old, I think, but there's a post of a hen that traveled 13 miles.
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
And you can see those data points.
Yep.
See where she was going and walking, and then where she eventually met up with the tom. And so you guys can see that in real time. Well, not real time, but you can see kind of what that looks like.
Sure. Yeah, and that's one of the things, and I guess maybe I can make that shameless plug for the lab as well right now, is that for us, so my position at the University of Nebraska as assistant professor, I have 60% extension, 40% research. And so with that, I always like to really pride ourselves in our lab on getting that information out. Because ultimately, if we want to see land management changes, we want to benefit turkeys or pronghorn or deer or whatever other wildlife species, we got to get that science out. Yes, we have to publish that in peer-reviewed journals, but we also got to take that information and get it out to people. And so that's one of the things we do, and we post things up every Wednesday. Actually, I have a turkey post coming up here in probably 2 hours. It'll be released for our lab every Wednesday. We get it sent out on our Instagram, Facebook, and then X accounts that we have. And so every week it changes. Some weeks it's on pronghorn or some other project in the lab, but this is very timely with turkey season coming around, so we wanted to get something out. So.
Yeah, but there's a lot of cool information on that page.
There is,
so folks, if you want to learn more about some research going on in Nebraska, follow that page because they put some cool stuff on there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, people just, if they're looking for it, just go in and Facebook, X, or Instagram at AWESM Lab, and they can find it. So,
that's cool. So in the first year of the research, findings.
Yeah. So, well, I guess maybe I'll speak a little bit to the movements because I think that was a nice segue there. So one of the things that's been really interesting for me, and again, since we're out in the western part of the state, we have more Merriams out in the western part of the state. And so they are known to move more. So that's not a big surprise per se when we started to see these birds moving a lot, like you mentioned, 13 miles. And I think that bird in particular was really interesting because it was like a beeline. I don't know if you look at that post, you're like, boy, that thing just like somebody went out with a GPS and just went for a walk one day. It wasn't like it wasn't like a zigzag or anything. It was just going in a beeline down to where I guess it wanted to hang out. So I think that's been honestly one of the biggest things I've seen. It's really the coolest in my mind is just realizing that if you're a landowner and you see these birds in your property in fall and winter, that does not necessarily mean that those same birds are going to be there come spring and summer. They may go elsewhere, but at the same time, you may also have birds from other locations coming to your property. They're just kind of all mixing up. That's just kind of they're just shuffling around the landscape. And I can speak to that particularly from a property I went up to hunt this past year and went up to the property before the season. We saw 75, 80 birds, and we're like, boy, this is going to be really nice. And then we get back there during the beginning of shotgun season. Not one of those birds is around.
Oh, boy. No.
And we're like calling and calling. We're like, where are all these birds at? We can't.
Where'd they go?
They just tossed us out there.
Disappeared.
Kind of like what we were talking earlier. When you've got a huge population like we did, early 2000s, for example, you kind of didn't realize that was going on because there was more birds around, shuffling around. Like you said, it was just one moving from A to B, and maybe this group from point C is moving back to where you were seeing them at point A, and you assume they're the same birds, but
no, and I think that's again from the data we've seen so far, just them shuffling around the landscape. I think the other thing is it's these birds, because they obviously are going to roost in the evenings, they're going to be pretty tied to those stream bottoms or places where you can find any type of roosting tree that they can be at a roosting structure. I know, during the wintertime, you'll even see them during the daytime. They may jump up on somebody's barn and sit up there. They're kind of just trying to get up and get a little aerial view per se. But
roosting spots are not as common as they are on the eastern side of the state by any means. So okay. So you saw
that's one of the big things.
Some pretty good movement then.
We have, and really in both areas. I know down in the Southwest we saw upwards of 20 miles from where we captured birds at, and they would move. Now, again, not all of them are doing that.
Yeah.
So some of them are, and we're seeing this with even like our pronghorn data. And we did a series of posts the past 3 weeks on that. You have ones that are residents, kind of homebodies that don't go really that far at all. Other ones that are, that true migratory, they just take off and go. And then you have other ones that are just kind of in the middle, and we're just not totally sure what they're doing. They just kind of bounce around the landscape and
kind of doing their own
thing. They're doing their own thing. And,
So. Now, you mentioned nest survivability, and you're going to have to tell me exactly how you figured that out.
Yep.
Do you see those that travel further or more of the homebodies when it comes to hen turkeys being more successful?
That's a great question. I can't speak to our data here yet because we haven't looked at that specifically.
Okay.
But it does, and I heard Mike talk about this the other day on a podcast. They're seeing some individuals that tend to be maybe a little more risk takers. Sometimes will go to places and they can find those areas and then they may have more likely success of that nest. In other words, ones that are moving off of that nest and taking, because once they set that nest up, it's not like that hen's just going to stay there, for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. She's going to take recesses. She has to go get water, food, and stuff. And so, they obviously will go off a little ways and then come back into that nest. And so ones that potentially are maybe a little risk takers may seem to have a little bit more success. But again, I think that's one of the things that we'll find out more as we work into this project in more detail and be able to kind of evaluate that.
Okay.
And we are, as a part of that, the nesting data, we're also collecting vegetation metrics. So we're looking at the vegetation structure around that nest. kind of understanding why those hens are selecting those sites compared to potentially some other random site on the landscape, and kind of getting a better visual of that, especially for a landowner, land manager. They're thinking about like, what do I need to be managing for?
What does this good habitat recovery look like?
Absolutely, and we're getting photos of that, so we can kind of show people, from presentations and things like that, social media. What does this look like? We don't know, and we obviously, that's what the data is showing us now. So
that's right. I think it's kind of cool that sometimes they're picking up on things maybe we don't right away.
Sure,
because we're looking at it from 5-6 foot off the ground compared to right down there at their level, so to speak, which is kind of interesting. So how do you measure nest success? So you've got the GPS collar on.
Sure.
Are you getting that close where you can see poults all of a sudden? Or are you getting there to after she moves off the nest to see, was it predated? Was it successful hatch? How do you do that?
Yeah, great question. So once that hen sets up her nest, we'll just keep tabs on her and basically say, okay, yeah, she's still there, and then continue to check on her every day. And make sure, so obviously we want to get in there quickly if we have a predation event, or if she decides to abandon her nest, or for whatever reason, like there's just a nest loss. Typically, so the incubation period is 28 days for turkeys. And so kind of, we want to obviously get within that period. We want, if a bird, say his nest is predated 2 or 3 days in or 5 days in, we want to be able to know when that occurs. And then when we go in, we'll see in the data is that bird will move off from that site. They're not going to just hang out right in that same spot. What you'll see is likely they'll move hundreds of yards away from that site, and then they continue to move to potentially looking for another spot in the near future to set up another nest. And so interestingly, I think as we're kind of working through that, so once you get those nests that hatch out. Then we will go in and we'll do, if it is a successful nest, we'll actually do brood surveys. And those brood surveys occur basically for up to 30 days post hatch of that bird. So the first 2 weeks of life for that hen, and particularly for the poults, the poults are actually flightless. So they're going to be hanging out in the ground with mom. And they'll just kind of ground roost for about 2 weeks, and then once they're able to physically fly up into some shrubbery, some small trees, et cetera, then they can get up above and get on, into more of an aerial position per se in the evenings. And so that first 2 weeks of life is critical. They you got to get them through that. If you don't have very high success there, obviously that's going to impact your long-term success for the population.
Yep.
And so, again, once those birds they hatch out, then we'll do these brood surveys every few days, and we'll go in and identify. The students go in basically really early in the morning, and then they can identify if that hen is on the ground, and then try to get. They don't necessarily count the number of poults, but they'll try to get an idea if they can physically see, hey, she has at least a poult with her. Because it is hard to identify, because they all kind of spread out and run in different directions and try to count them all. It's a little hard to do that.
They're tiny little guys.
They are tiny, absolutely, at that point in life. And so that's kind of how we, so the nest success really goes back to, are they successful or are they not? So it's kind of a, 1-0 type thing. And then if they're not successful, we say how many days into that 28-day period was she on that nest until it was either predated or abandoned or whatever caused that nest loss. And then we'll try to get some identification of if there, we have any evidence there of, whether say it was a predator or something else. But one of the challenges is, if she gets, if we don't get a notification for several hours, something else could come in there and easily scavenge that site. And so that's a challenge.
Oh, there you go. So kind of a secondary.
Yep.
Predator. Yeah. How many hens that got actually predated themselves? Not just the eggs, but many of the hens get taken?
Yeah, we have a few. It's not that. I was looking at the data the other day. It's not really that. The survival as a whole is fairly high from what we've seen so far, particularly for the hens. Obviously, for the males, you're going to have some loss to hunter harvest. That's not a surprise. We expected that. But yeah, from the hens, so far we're seeing fairly high hen survival in the landscape. But again, I always tell people too is you got to think about these birds from all life stages, because you've got the nest to the poult, and then that subadult, and then on up to adult stage. So you're managing for these birds 365 to get them. You got to be able to get them to that fall population. Yeah. So there's a lot of moving pieces in the middle there.
That's what I think is really critical for everybody to realize is just that. And it's not identical habitat that they need from nesting to winter survival, to brooding habitat, to, poult where they're on the ground, when they're able to jump into those lower shrubs or lower branches, it changes.
It does change, yeah. Well, and I've seen this a lot when I've had folks say, well, hey, does this look like high quality nesting habitat? And it would be maybe a patch of brome grass, for example. And it's like, well, no, because they need more openings. We need more space in there. And we actually, on our social media page, we post about that. We're going to be doing more of that this spring, showcasing what is nesting habitat, what is brood rearing habitat, what are we observing, just to get folks an idea what does that look like. I think it's important and we'll do videos and photos and things like that. Just kind of get that more visual picture of it.
I've heard from I believe, like you said, Professor Chamberlain, that there's some places that we've concentrated quite a bit on nesting habitat, and we've got that. We've always, it seems to be, especially in that hunter's mindset. All right, here's the habitat I see them in fall and winter, or in case of turkey, spring. So they need that. I can make that happen type of stuff. But right after those poults hatch, they've got a very specific diet, for example, and that brooding habitat is one thing that can be lacking. We don't even know it at times.
Yeah, so they do need a little more structure for that nest, but then once they get to that brooding stage, they got to be able to get through those patches, particularly during that first 2 weeks of life. That's a pretty critical stage for them. Yeah. If they get moisture on them at that young stage, and they're still not figuring out kind of the thermoregulation process, they can easily, succumb then overnight, if it dips down into cold temperatures and such. And so it's one of those things where you're trying to create enough structure that they have especially from other predators around, both this aerial and then obviously your mesopredators that you may have in the landscape. But thinking about how do you create enough so that they physically can get through there. If it's so dense that they can't physically walk through, that's what you're not going to have much success of them spending time there. And I think one of the things I've seen very similar to what you just described is, well, I saw turkeys there. Well, just because you see them there does not mean that's high quality habitat. Just because that's where they're at. That may be the only option that they have in that landscape is that on the landscape to select from, and so they spend their time there. So
good point. All right, so we're in a new cycle.
Yep.
This last winter, trying to trap some more turkeys for collar. Well, I keep saying collaring, but
hell, you can use it. They're GPS tagging,
collaring, backpacking, whatever you want to call it.
I just don't want anyone, listeners, keep in mind, you're not going to see any neck collars on these turkeys that I know of.
No, these are all backpacks.
Yeah, it's kind of like that ear tag and that neck collar. Like sometimes you'll see on our bighorn sheep or something like that. It's a little different.
It is. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So so last year we had 89 birds that we had GPS tagged. This year we had a little over, I think it was 110 that we ended up, we GPS tagged this year. We have some of those individuals that are obviously around from last year that we're still collecting data on, that are still out in the landscape.
How long do those collars last?
So it kind of it kind of depends on the fixed frequencies, because obviously, if you're taking them really regular like that every 15 minutes, that can burn that battery up pretty fast, because these transmitters are only a couple inches or so big, and you have to have a really small battery. You kind of think about your cell phone. Over time, it's going to need to be charged probably regularly every night or whatever, and these things don't last forever. We obviously still have a number of transmitters from last year that are still online, and we'll go into that. And that's one of the things I think we're really interested to see is, for where those birds were at nesting last year, of the transmitters that we have online from this past year, where are those birds going again? Are they going to those same spots? And literally up until, a few years ago or so, when we started getting more GPS technology, we really didn't have a good handle on that, because ultimately, even the early GPS technology wouldn't last for more than a year. And so you're trying to say, well, I want to get these transmitters to go for a couple of years to really see, are these hens nesting the same areas or similar areas? What is do they learn from one year to the next, and kind of maybe this is maybe a riskier area, so I'm going to move over here. And hopefully we'll get more of that data this year now that we have more of those out. But yeah, we have a whole nother batch of birds out there in the landscape now. So we got transmitters on.
Oh, that's pretty cool. And it's really going to be interesting to see, because I'm sure as you trap it and before you put that transmitter on, are you doing anything with age? Obviously,
yeah.
Here's a male, here's a female, type thing. But are there aging or taking blood samples or anything else like that goes along with it?
Yeah. So, and another plug for the lab. We actually have on our lab website, if people go just Google AWESM Lab at UNL, you can go on there under the Turkey Research page. You can learn more about the project as a whole. But we also have under our social media page, we have past videos that kind of showed that whole process from capture to releasing the birds.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, so in that process, when we capture the birds, and we use these what we call walk-in traps, or primarily what we use.
Oh, okay.
So they kind of walk into that trap, and we have some students that are sitting away in a blind, and they pull a little rope, and they drop the doors, and they're in there.
Yep.
No rocket nets right now?
We don't have any rocket nets. We did use some drop nets this past month, a couple months ago for down in the Southwest, and they work fairly well. But yeah, those are probably the walk-in and the drop nets were most successful. But once those birds were captured, then we put them into National Wild Turkey Federation boxes, and then we began the process of being able to band them, put a leg band on them. We collected basically samples from everything from looking at the spur length to, again, you mentioned about how we obviously did the sex. We would obviously determine was it a subadult, was it an adult, and then genetic material we were collecting, blood samples. A variety of things, different body measurements and things like that then can all be put into some modeling efforts so we can kind of see the condition of those birds at that time. How does that's always a question is, birds that are potentially in better physiological condition are basically have shown to be more successful at hatching a nest out, which makes sense. They're in better condition, they're less stressed per se. And so you essentially can see a little higher rates there. And so we'll be able to tie a lot of that data together to kind of see, are they the ones that are nesting earlier, or are those the ones that tend to be a little bit better physiological condition? So,
Fun stuff.
Yeah.
And now back to the listening in on
Sure.
turkeys. You said you put out some monitors. Was that part of it last year at all, or is that a new twist this year?
No, that was from last year as well. So one of the questions or the objectives of the project was to really evaluate gobbling chronology. And so what that means in simple terms is basically when are birds starting to gobble, and when is the peak, and then how does that eventually wane off. And so kind of think about I always say like a normal distribution. So obviously there's going to be at some point you're going to see that peak in the spring, and then eventually it's going to decrease. Birds gobble throughout the whole year, but ultimately you're going to see obviously significant peaks. And obviously from a hunting standpoint, that's what we all as hunters, we go out and listen for. We're listening for the birds.
Want to hear gobbles.
So if you're not hearing gobbles, it's not as exciting as a hunt. So essentially these monitors are out. We have 30 in each region, Northwest and Southwest, of these acoustic monitors. And literally the way I kind of always envision it and try to explain it is it's basically like a tape recorder out there that's programmed to turn on and turn off at certain times during the day. And it's just every single day, 7 days a week for months on end, it's collecting that data and recording it. It stores it on an SD card. Our students go out, they'll pull that SD card out, they'll put it into a computer, download all the data. And this is a collaboration for this gobbling chronology with Mike Chamberlain and his lab down in Georgia. And we're sending all that data down there, and they're actually analyzing that. They developed some basically fancy AI technology, can go through and pull those gobbles out. So
they showcased that technology. Mike talked a little bit about it at NWTF convention in February, and it is really cool stuff.
It is. Yeah.
It basically goes through. They train an AI model on what the frequency of a gobble sounds like.
Yeah.
So then it plugs it in through that model, and basically you just run it, and it'll pull out all the gobbles from that chronology.
And I heard the other day I think in Nebraska, the data from year one was around, they were about 92% accurate in detecting the gobbles in there. And again, it's like anything, it's not perfect. There's always going to be limitations.
No,
but you have, so the thing is the amount of data. So like, we're talking, terabytes of data, hours upon hours. Another project I have on pheasants, we actually had, I think it was over 8,000 hours of audio tape that were recorded. And so who's going to sit there for 8,000 hours worth of tape?
You're saving somebody a lot of time.
So it really helps out quite a bit.
Folks, you can see where assumptions are born. Because you think about it, not probably all that long ago that we had that ability to create something that could hit all those frequencies. Because, probably 20 years ago, it would have been somebody listening to all of it, or probably going through fast and, back up. I think that, nope, that's a woodpecker. All right, moving on, type thing. And that would be quite the job. And I can guarantee you that if you had someone listen minute by minute, 92% accuracy is a whole bunch better than what us humans would be doing.
Yeah. Well, it's the same way even with getting game cameras. You get thousands of images, and after a period of time, you start waning like, oh, okay, I'm ready to go do something different. I'm tired of looking these same
hey, look,
pictures.
a raccoon. Hey, look, yep.
Yeah, there's a squirrel again.
Squirrel. It's that same squirrel again.
So.
Which is pretty interesting because we're kind of timing that out. Obviously, turkeys are gobbling in Nebraska right now.
Yep.
Breeding season probably not yet started?
Not yet. Yeah. So one of the things, jumping back to the nest survival data. So what we saw on average, so in the Southwest, we had about 38% nest survival down there.
That sounds pretty good.
And that was, relative to other states. And then up in the Chadron area, we had over 40% nest survival. Now, granted, that's across 3 nesting attempts for some of these birds combined. So that's all of the data for those regions combined. So obviously it fluctuates from one nesting attempt to another amongst a suite of birds. But yeah, fairly good. And again, it's 1 year of data, so that's all I always tell people. Take it with a grain of salt.
Yep.
Things could be totally different this year. You just maybe had really good conditions last year. We'll see, how it plays out for this year. So.
And I know there's a lot of folks probably wondering, 30%, that doesn't sound great. I mean, why aren't we up at 60 or 70? Sure. But for wildlife populations and turkeys in particular, those are pretty high.
Yeah, well, and I think that when you look at it from the standpoint of you have this data from 1 year, you're saying, okay, well, what potential? We didn't have a ginormous sample size, obviously, so we're kind of thinking about how many nests do we have across the board. But as we continue to collect that data, we'll be able to see, okay, what. Because a lot of states are really down in that 20% range. Mm-hmm. So, we obviously are, at least from 1 year, are a little bit better. So we'll see how, again, that plays out. But I think that when you kind of compare that to, say, like a domestic flock of birds that you're, the one challenge that you have is that, really kind of multiple challenges, but you have a lot of variables that are affecting those birds. So I always say it's kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts. These birds experience a lot of different things, from weather to predators to other aspects of that landscape changing. And so that has impacts on the nest success of those birds. So, having it in that range, I think right now, it's fairly good. So we'll see what happens for the next couple of years.
And I know we're learning a whole bunch more about turkeys than we ever have before. Is there an ideal for sustaining a population? Is there a number?
Yeah.
And I know I'm backing into a corner here.
Sure. No. Yeah. That's a great question. I don't really have a good number that would be, the most sustainable per se. I think that's part of the challenge. And I come back to this kind of this 365 approach is you could have really high nest survival, but then you may have really low brood survival.
Good point.
And then you're not getting those birds to that adult stage. And so therefore you're not having an impact long-term. So back to your earlier point about having a lot of nesting habitat out there, we can manage and get a lot of that out there. But if we're not managing for brood habitat, well, that's a problem.
It's not doing you any good.
We got to be thinking about these birds from 365, and we have, as a part of this grant, we're building where it's basically a large-scale website. It's going to be basically an upland game bird site. We're going to have pheasant stuff on there, turkey stuff from a couple of the projects I'm involved in, and with that turkey side of things, we want to be able to showcase, what is that? What's nesting habitat look like? What is brooding habitat? But then also looking at what does the literature basically say around that 365 management approach. What can we in Nebraska landowners be doing to think about management for those birds 365 days a year? I think that's the important aspect. So, there's a lot of and tying back to the gobbling data, that's the point of getting that is one, to kind of see those peaks, but then look at that relative to the nesting. And so when is that peak in gobbling occurring? And then how does that tie into when these birds are starting to nest? So what we saw from this past year is kind of our median first nests for basically across both areas were basically in early May is when we're getting these nests on the ground. So early May is kind of, and I've talked to colleagues over in Missouri, and that's what they're seeing in their state as well. It's kind of early May. When I did my PhD down in Georgia, we had birds nesting down there. It was in middle of March already, middle to late part of March. So. It's a little different, but again, there's a latitudinal difference as well, from there to here. So
it's interesting that Missouri birds are nesting in early May, and that's right about when the season wraps up down there.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So,
and that's what a lot of hunters are kind of probably watching this study and other studies on is timing of that.
Sure.
The gobbling and the nesting and all that type of stuff, because as hunters, we want to have something to hunt, right?
Sure.
But we also want that opportunity. And here in Nebraska, we're kind of looking at that. just a little bit. March 25th is the traditional opener for archery here in the state of Nebraska, and then that Saturday closest to April 15th is traditional shotgun opener for everybody. What impacts are you going to have? Because originally you thought when we first started getting back into turkey hunting, and the reason we got into spring, because it's pretty much the only bird we hunt during their nesting
Sure, that is
season,
true. Yeah.
is, well, again, one tom, many hens. Everybody's happy as long as we don't take them all. We take this one. Another one will move in and replace them pretty fast, and that's just the way nature happens.
Yeah.
And we're finding out there may be a little more strategy or more complexity. And I point towards the hens. We've heard studies that it's hens when they go to nest is very organized, perhaps, or structured by hierarchy. So that'll be interesting to follow as well.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I know Mike and his lab, they're exploring more of that realm, of kind of like the general structure of these flocks, and that's something that it's hard to observe that in the wild, because unless you're having somebody out there regularly with those flocks, or you have a captive flock. It's hard to observe those kind of dynamics that you see, and kind of, if you remove, because there's been questions like, if we remove these dominant toms, how long does it take until you get another dominant tom that's going to come in there? They're going to fight out, who's going to be the next, in that pecking order.
Because that's kind of getting sorted out before season 2.
Sure, true, absolutely, yeah. So you lose those dominant ones, and what happens to that shuffle? How long does that take? And then does that, there's questions like, does that delay any of that process for the breeding? And so
exactly,
we're learning more.
And that's where it's kind of neat, folks. We're getting some national data, and now this is probably the first time that Merriam's have really been looked into at this level.
Yeah, at least here in Nebraska. Yeah, I know other states have looked into them, and I know Mike is, he's involved in a lot of different projects, and they have other data for other states. But yeah, here in Nebraska,
which if you can start correlating nest success and peak gobbling times and all that type of stuff to when they start nesting, it really starts to give you some formulas that, all right, we've got this data, but not this, but we know from this other research over here that we can make some correlations and all that. Really kind of neat seeing all that numbers and evidence being used to support each other, rather than just kind of, well, they're a lot like pheasants, right? They got spurs. They're just
colorful heads.
Colorful, yeah. They just one rooster, many hens, one tom, many hens. Yep, all that good stuff. And just learn more and more.
But a great thing about all this research is it'll help in the long run. It'll help agencies kind of learn how to structure their seasons more too.
And
we'll figure it out, how does season structure and dates and times impact, sustainability and harvest and things like that.
Yeah, and that's one of those things in knowing that it used to be more of, are we impacting the hens and their nesting? With our spring hunting, is we really didn't pay much attention to the gobblers that we were taking out, because we just assumed, hey, they're going to be replaced. That's an easy thing. We know that. And we're finding out, well, maybe there's a little bit more to it than we thought. But I do know, just anecdotally, and I know that you're not going to include this in your research yet, but when we have these really warm springs, I will run into poults here in the state of Nebraska. When we have a chilly spring, not so much. So there's obviously some photo periods, some, peak of gobbling, all that type of stuff, and when conditions are right. Does temperature ever, that you know of, any research you've shown, does temperature ever play into when hens nest or where?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know if I've ever actually been asked that question. That's a good question. I'm sure Mike would probably have a little bit more information. I know in particular if it's a wet season, that definitely can play an impact on them. Which is not surprising. And so to your point, it's possible. I don't have any information on that.
Might be just that local thing. And that's the other thing, folks, to keep in mind is when we manage populations, we got to manage them on a bigger area than just, all right, this 40 acres here and that 20 over there and that type of stuff. Because now we're finding out they're moving. They might move several ranches, much less farms or acreages over here. Yeah,
well, and that's why I always, in our lab, we focus a lot on kind of bridging that gap between ag production and conservation, and finding, what I like to say, kind of finding the balance. How can a landowner who is passionate about turkey hunting but also has their main livelihood is production ag, how can they find that balance so that they can have quality habitat out there for those birds, but at the same time, obviously have a profitable operation? And so it's really not, unless you're managing tens of thousands of acres at a time, that landowner needs to be working with their neighbors. So developing cooperatives where you can say, hey, I'm working with these individuals together, and we're all passionate about turkeys, but maybe our primary livelihood is production ag. And finding those ways that you can balance them out. And it is possible. It's not. And so that's where like conservation programs could come into play. And I think this science can really help play into that. It's like, how can we make, from my perspective, an extension, make this information more accessible to landowners? Awesome. Doing field days, showing them, okay, here's what we're seeing as kind of the nesting habitat, the brood rearing habitat. This is kind of the missing pieces that, we may be seeing on the landscape. One of the things I've also been really interested in, and this is regarding the brood habitat, is obviously once those poults, like I said, they're in the first 2 weeks of life, they're on the ground, they got to fly up. Well, if you have areas where you have very little mid-story cover, it's pretty unlikely that a poult just, that big is going to be flying up into like a 100-foot tall cottonwood tree. So do we potentially like regulate or kind of relegate, I should say, areas of these brood patches to very limited places on the landscape, so that hen has to move that brood to a further distance, potentially posing more risk for where that is. So those are some things we'll be able to explore with this project to kind of get a better sense of where she's taking that brood, how far away day to day, she's taking that brood. Is she kind of hanging out in a certain area? Because we'll have GPS points on them. Yeah. They're doing brood surveys, so we'll be able to get a handle on that. And so
they get all what they need closer by. That's pretty cool. All right, we're going to have to wrap it up here. Sure. Appreciate it. Again, folks, Dr. Andy Little, University of Nebraska, here in Lincoln, as well as Extension. But before we let you go, because I know there's some hunters, and I'm one of them. So from what you found last year with listening to those gobblers, and if you were going to find yourself in the field, you only had one day to go out and hunt and listen for gobbles, when would that be?
Well,
we need a date. We need a date.
Yeah, boy, I wish I would say every day is what I would say. Every day.
A good answer.
That's every day. You got to be out there. Man. If you're not out there, we were just talking about that before. If you're not out there, you can't kill a turkey. So you got to be out there in the field. And
all right.
He's not letting you get away with that easy, Hershey.
I was thinking April 20th or May 6th or something.
He was already penciling in a sick day on his calendar.
That's right. Yeah,
exactly. You got to know what days to save. So all right. Well, I appreciate you being back in here. We'll have to get you in again to talk to where this project's gone, as well as everything else that the AWESM Lab is absolutely up to. So folks, again, if you haven't already, give us a subscribe, give us a thumbs up, whatever you need to do to know when the next one of these drops, as well as if you've got any questions for Professor Little, make sure you type it down and we'll get it to him. But until next time,
Hunt Nebraska, brought to you by your Nebraska Game and Parks Commission.